Our call to worship this morning is short and sweet and is written by Lisa Friedman. And I can tell by the smiles that the slide is up. I just loved that image of interconnectedness there. We touch the floor to remember that wherever we bring our best self is holy ground. We reach for the sky to remember that we are part of a mystery much bigger than ourselves. We hold hands to remember that we need one another and are part of one human family. We join voices to remember that each of us has a gift to offer the world and to use in making the world a better place. Come, let us worship together this morning. William Schultz, the fifth president of the Unitarian Universalist Association and now the president of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, wrote, "Hundreds of years ago, St. Lawrence asked, 'Whom should I adore, the Creator or the creation?' Most Western philosophies and religions have answered back, 'Adore the Creator,' and then they supplied an image, whether it be Zeus or Jehovah or Christ, to be adored. But as Unitarian Universalists, our answer is far different. Whom should we adore? The creation, surely, the holy, made manifest to every one of us in the transactions of the everyday. This is a fundamental departure from religion's preoccupation with abstraction. It's not a distant, mysterious God to whom we make appeal, or even the cold vagueness of progress or evolution or creativity or history. The gods or goddesses, if you prefer, the most precious and the profound, are accessible to us each and every day in the taste of honey or the feel of a stone. And this, in turn, is why we love the earth, honor the human body, and bless the stars. Religion is not just a matter of things that we can't see. For us, the holy is not hidden, but shows its face each and every day in the world's exuberance. And earlier we sang, "Wake now, my senses," because we experience this world of ours through our senses, through our everyday lives, and bless it as we go. But as we all know by now, our beloved earth and all things on this earth are under siege. Have you ever started, this is like a confession here, have you ever started a project around the house and found that before you can do what you're setting out to do, you have to take care of other things that come first? You start doing it and then something else comes, and before you know it, you're 10 steps before where you actually wanted to get to. Well, in some ways for me, writing this sermon has followed that same trajectory, because it began with the idea of marking the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, which will be taking place in Paris from November 30th to December 11th. But as I read and reflected, what became apparent that beyond the facts and statistics about how climate change is occurring with its devastating short-term consequences and its long-term real possibility of decimating the human population along with so many other life forms, beyond all that, underneath all that, lies a grief and fear and uncertainty that accompanies us as we live our lives in this day and age. What word comes to your mind when you think about the state of our world at present? Just shout it out. And I wonder also how many of us are alarmed not just at the current state of the world with its mixture of negatives, I heard, and positives, but also the future toward which we're heading. And the outcome may be bleak. It's like the joke, if you can joke about such things. It's like the joke where there are two planets that meet. And the first planet asks, "How are you?" And the second planet says, "Not so well. I've got the Homo sapiens." That's not the punchline yet. And the first planet says, "Don't worry, I had the same. It won't last long." Yeah, that's one of those ouch jokes, right? Dr. David Corton puts it, "The earth is primary, humans are derivative." And yet, for much of the time, we go about our everyday lives with this unease and fear and sadness lying just below our consciousness. We are living in an unprecedented time. Yes, there have been famines and wars and diseases and tragedies all through human history. But this generation, our generation now on the earth, has the distinction of being the only generation of people to truly hold the fate of human life and multiple forms of plant and creatures in our hands. This is hard to face, this pivotal psychological reality of our time. But if we are to survive and to thrive, we need to not just face the reality, but also find a way to embrace it, as difficult as that may be. The temptation might be to try to avoid it because it's too overwhelming to talk about. But there is no escape. It surrounds us and it lives deep in our being. The real danger lies in not talking about it, not facing up to the challenges and despair, as well as acknowledging the joy and the hopefulness that are also part of living in this time. And that's the good news, that there can be joy and hope in this brave new world that we're entering. Václav Havel has written, "Hope is an orientation of the spirit. It's an orientation of the heart." This hope is a choice that we make, a choice not to deny the situation at hand or despair that we are too late, or that our contribution might be too small to make a difference. It's choosing to be part of the solution, part of building that beautiful world that deep down we know is possible. And it's moving forward with intention. It involves having a clear understanding of 3 steps. One is to have a clear understanding of our reality today, to do your research, to understand what's going on. 2 is to identify what to do or what we hope to do to move things in a particular direction. And then logically, the 3rd is then taking steps to move in that direction. We simply do not have the luxury any longer to deny what's happening with climate change. We're seeing its effects happening daily all over the globe. And we simply do not have the luxury to despair either. Each of us, each person here today and beyond, brings their own unique gifts to be offered. Each of us has the power to learn and make choices and then act on those choices. Now, many of you were here a couple weeks ago when we did our emergency preparedness workshop. And in that workshop, we talked about preparing for local, immediate emergencies. But truly, climate change is the overarching emergency of our time. Usually, when we become aware of an emergency, we're inspired to action. We reach down deep inside of ourselves and we find those reserves of strength and resilience and maybe even a sense of purpose as we live into the satisfaction of making a positive difference. And so today is the first of several sermons during which we'll explore how to prepare ourselves for this larger scale, ongoing emergency, which I think involves an emergence into a new understanding of ourselves and our world as we rise to this most difficult of occasions. And so we're going to start the journey today with looking at 3 stories of our time. These stories aren't works of fiction, but they're rather the way that we make sense of what is happening around us. These stories are deeply religious and spiritual in nature because at its core, religion is about helping us make sense of the world around us. The way we perceive the world, our invisible ideologies and belief systems, what we hold true in turn creates the external structures and institutions that will either lead us into ruin or will lead us into a sustainable and interconnected view of the future. In this understanding, our climate crisis is a spiritual crisis, and it reaches to the core of our beings, and it encompasses all that we are and all that we believe in being human. So the model that I'm going to talk about today, these 3 stories, draws from the work of many people, but I want to say the names out loud because I'll be drawing from them. David Corton, Molly Young Brown, Chris Johnstone, Joanna Macy, Charles Eisenstein, and many more. So we know we're in a crisis, in an emergency as a species. Yet the first story of our time is business as usual. In this story, the defining assumption is that there's little need to change the way that we live. Economic growth is seen as necessary for prosperity, and the central plot, as we all know it, is getting ahead. And many of us in the U.S. are living out the success story of this business as usual model with a comfortable life where we have access to food and clean water and shelter and material goods. This is the story told by our policymakers and corporate leaders, that the economy must grow and that consumption is good for the economy, that any economic downturns are just aberrations and we'll be growing again soon. And it's almost un-American if you don't go out and do your duty to buy. I still remember in the recession, I do love our president, but I remember him saying, it's your duty, go out and buy. And so of course I did my, GDI thing, my goddamn independent thing, and I said, I'm not gonna go buy. It's been really frustrating, especially this time of year as they're pushing the shopping season. I think it's already started, hasn't it? Yeah, it's already started that we're supposed to go and buy. Because for a market economy to grow, it needs to increase sales. And the tragedy here is that what we call business as usual with its ultra-consumer-driven society and economy has become the model of success, catching on around the world and increasing the world appetite for consumption. In this story, nature is seen as a commodity to be used for human purposes, and the problems of other peoples and nations and species are not our concern. The up by the bootstraps, each person for themselves in the race to get ahead as we gobble up massive amounts of energy and create massive amounts of waste. And this shadow side of our modern living, this business as usual story, leads us into the second story, which is called the Great Unraveling. And the Great Unraveling is a coin termed by Dr. David Corton. This Great Unraveling is a story that points out the disasters of business as usual. It's the account of economic decline, depletion of resources, disturbance of the climate, social divisions and wars, and mass extinction of species. It's not a nice bedtime story. The Great Unraveling is the story of economic decline in which our economy is seen in overshoot. This is when something moves beyond the point at which it's sustainable. At this point, we need to notice the overshoot and then make necessary corrections. But if correction doesn't happen, the system can only go so far before it reaches a point of breakdown and collapse. And the risk we're in is that this previous story of business as usual has driven us into overshoot with its ever-increasing demand on our natural resources and ever-increasing generation of waste, both toxic and otherwise. The more we push beyond these sustainable limits, the more this unraveling occurs. The Great Unraveling is also a story of resource depletion, both energy resources and natural resources. It's the story of climate change. The 1980s was the warmest decade ever on record, and each decade since has been warmer than the one before. By now, we are all familiar with the wide-ranging global effects of this change. And I thought, Mary, as you talked about going over the poles, I've done that flight before, and I wonder how much of the ice is melted as you go over. Increases in weather-related disasters, drought and crop failure in some parts of the world, increase in flooding and extreme rainfall events in others. And the hard part about this is it's a feedback loop that amplifies with each fraction of a degree our planet heats up. Unfortunately, the experts tell us that it's too late to stop climate change. It's too late to avoid the suffering it will cause and is already causing. As Jay Leno, trust Jay Leno to come up with something funny here, as he quipped, according to a UN report, the global warming outlook is much worse than originally predicted, which is pretty bad since they originally predicted it would destroy the planet. But unfortunately, there's still more. Besides the economic decline, resource depletion, and climate change, the story of the Great Unraveling includes social division and war. We see the results of this every day. The work that Hal Hill has been doing to raise our awareness of the issue of income inequality fits into this story of unraveling as we see the wealth flowing much more to the rich than to the poor as our economy has grown. I came across this fact that we could eliminate all extreme poverty and world hunger for 1/10 of the amount that the world spends each year to build up their military. And finally, the unraveling includes the mass extinction of species, with fully 1/3 of all amphibians, 1/5 of all mammals, and 1/8 of all bird species now threatened with extinction. Take a moment and just let the enormity of this situation sink in. According to a UN report, that means that we humans are responsible for the greatest major extinction event in the history of the Earth since the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. This is hard stuff. I look out on your faces and I feel like apologizing, but this is important stuff. And if we can't talk about it here, where we gather together to really chew on the deepest spiritual happenings of our time, then where else can we talk about it? But these two stories, business as usual and the Great Unraveling, are occurring simultaneously, and many of us in our everyday lives move between these two stories. Increasingly, though, we see that this business as usual story is being interrupted by the effects and the bad news of the Great Unraveling story. And as these issues of the great unraveling are difficult to face, I mean, we can't face this as a steady stream, we as a culture tend to look away, to live in what Al Gore called a culture of distraction. I mean, we turn on the news and it gets so frustrating that we turn on something else, something light. I do it myself. But thankfully, there is good news. There is hope. If we learn from the damage already done and make constructive choices about our future, we can back out of overshoot and move toward a desirable and sustainable future. Which brings us, thankfully, to our third story. This story is called The Great Turning. This story is based in the understanding that the whole basis of our society is in a time of transition and transformation, including people's relationships with one another and our relationship with the earth. And although we're in the early stages of this transition, ideas and practices are spreading. At first, this thinking may be at the fringes or confined to a small number of people, but when critical mass is reached, the viewpoints and practices that were once considered on the fringe become mainstream. We saw this happen to a certain degree with the issue of marriage equality. There were people sort of yelling and protesting out on the fringes, and then all of a sudden it kind of went like this, and boom. You got critical mass, and now we have marriage equality. So in the Great Turning, there's a growing understanding of ourselves as interconnected to all creatures and to the earth. And this is a shift. I mean, those of us who are living now may not see what a shift it is, because this whole concept of us as consumers is slowly shifting to seeing ourselves instead as healers. And it's a shift from individualism to understanding ourselves as communal beings. This story, I don't think, is readily visible yet in the mainstream media. At least it's not visible to me. But as we explore it deeply, I think that everyone sitting in this room will probably see yourself already living into this great turning, which involves 3 dimensions, and all 3 dimensions of the Great Turning are necessary and mutually reinforcing. So in the one dimension of the story, we have holding actions. And these holding actions include raising awareness of the damage done by our business as usual story and trying to slow down or reverse its effects. In the holding actions dimension, we act. We speak up at protests and rallies. I know we had congregants at the rally in Santa Barbara yesterday, encouraging constructive action at the upcoming summit in Paris. And some people here in this room might be participating in the action. I know next Sunday in Ventura, they're having an action, and I'm going to be participating next Sunday down in Long Beach. And while these may seem small, they do have an impact. Witness the defeat of Keystone XL Pipeline, which when I was at a conference with Bill McKibben about 4 years ago, all of us there were totally convinced that Keystone XL was going to happen. There was sort of a depression almost at the conference because we just felt so helpless. But with the leadership of 350.org and Bill McKibben and people saying no, we at least have put it off, hopefully forever, but at least for a while. Holding actions are essential, but not sufficient for the Great Turning to occur. Along with stopping the damage, we need to transform the systems causing harm. And this is the work of the dimension called structural change. And the structural change involves developing a new bottom line for businesses that count success not just in financial terms, but also take into account the bottom lines of social and environmental benefits. They call this the triple bottom line. It involves our everyday choices as much as possible to buy organic and fair trade and locally, and it involves removing our support for behaviors and products that we know to be part of the problem. And I know a number of people are already well into this dimension. If you just look out at the number of Priuses in our parking lot, you know this to be true. Through our choices about how and where to travel, where to shop, how to save, we are helping to shape the development of a new economy. And we also make choices in our political arena. Who do we trust to make decisions based on our priorities? Which brings us to the third and last aspect of the Great Turning. And these aren't like 1, 2, 3. These all flow together. This is a shift in consciousness. This shift is occurring in the hearts and minds of people as we grow in understanding ourselves as living on this fragile, beautiful planet as part of the interdependent web of existence. We Unitarian Universalists are at the forefront of this shift in consciousness as we've included this dimension of interdependence as one of our seven principles since 1984. As Joanna Macy points out, we live at a time when a new view of reality is emerging, where spiritual insight and scientific discovery both contribute to our understanding of ourselves as intimately interwoven in our world. In this development, in this dimension, we tend to our spiritual development to help enhance our capacity and desire to act in our world, and our action in the world feeds our spiritual selves and widens our web of relationships. Václav Havel wrote, "Either we will achieve an awareness of our place in the living and life-giving organism of our planet, or we will face the threat that our evolutionary journey may be set back thousands or even millions of years. And that is why we must see this issue as a challenge to behave responsibly and not as a harbinger of the end of the world." So the choice is ours to make. If there are to be future generations to look back gratefully on this pivotal time in history, we must choose life and choose the life-giving story of the Great Turning and align our energy and action with that. And I leave you with hope that we are all part of the story, that each of us has our part that we can play in this turning, and with the promise that in the new year, we'll explore deeper how we go about this transition with courage and grace into this brave new world. Differences, and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. Let us pause in silent witness to that unity. And may the blessings of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. And may love's presence abide in your heart now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Blessed be. And now, as we extinguish the light of our communal chalice, this is when our service truly begins, and the congregation responds.
We carry